The developer offered pennies for his property. He thought he was buying out a helpless old man who didn't know any better. He thought he could wave a check for $50,000 in front of someone who had lived in the same weather-beaten farmhouse for 45 years, and that the sheer weight of corporate authority would force a signature onto the dotted line. What the developer didn't see, tucked just beneath the rusted brim of the old man's baseball cap, was the glint of a high-definition lens, and what he didn't know was that the entire interaction was being streamed live to 300,000 people. In the brutal world of modern real estate, predators are used to operating in the dark, using backroom deals, zoning loopholes, and aggressive legal threats to swallow up generational land for pennies on the dollar. But when you drag a predator into the blinding light of a digital camera, the power dynamic doesn't just shift, it completely shatters. This is the story of how a multi-million-dollar tech conglomerate tried to strong-arm a stubborn local mechanic, only to realize, far too late, that they hadn't stumbled onto a victim, they had walked directly into a trap designed to ruin them. To understand how a massive corporate entity ended up begging a single property owner for mercy, you have to look at the contrast between the two forces that collided on that humid Tuesday afternoon. On one side, you had Julian Vance, a junior acquisition executive for Vanguard Horizon Holdings. Julian was 28 years old, wore a $3,000 tailored suit that looked entirely ridiculous standing in a gravel driveway, and smelled of expensive cologne and sheer arrogance. He was used to winning because his company gave him an unlimited arsenal of intimidation tactics. If a homeowner refused to sell, Julian's team would simply buy up the surrounding parcels, initiate construction at 5 in the morning, manipulate local parking ordinances, and make life an absolute living hell until the owner cracked. On the other side of the gravel driveway stood Arthur, Pop Miller. Arthur was 72, his hands were permanently stained with motor oil from a lifetime of fixing tractors, and his home was a modest, 2-acre plot of land that sat precisely in the center of Vanguard's planned $40 million commercial shipping hub. For months, Vanguard had been quietly absorbing the surrounding properties, paying fair market value to neighbors who were eager to cash out and move to the suburbs. But Arthur's land was different. It wasn't just a house, it was the site of Miller's Automotive, a shop his father had built in 1952. Arthur didn't want a condo in Florida. He didn't want a shiny new truck. He wanted to die in the house he was born in. Vanguard knew that if they couldn't secure Arthur's 2 acres, their entire logistical layout would fail. The main access road for their shipping trucks legally had to pass directly through where Arthur's hydraulic lift currently sat. This structural bottleneck meant Arthur held all the cards, but Vanguard assumed he was too uneducated to realize his own leverage. They assumed an old mechanic would see 50 grand as a fortune, pack his bags, and quietly disappear into the sunset. Julian Vance arrived that day confident that he would wrap up the acquisition in 10 minutes. He walked up the porch steps, his shiny leather shoes crunching loudly on the dry gravel, carrying a sleek leather briefcase that contained a lowball contract and a cashier's check. He didn't notice the tiny, weather-resistant security enclosure mounted to the oak tree near the driveway, nor did he see the subtle wire running down the porch railing into a modified desktop computer inside the kitchen. Arthur had spent the last 3 weeks working with his grandson, a 21-year-old cybersecurity student, to set up an unhackable, multi-angle Livestream network. They knew Vanguard would eventually send someone to threaten or trick them, and Arthur wanted every single word recorded in real time, broadcast to an independent local news collective and a rapidly growing true crime and corporate exposure channel on Twitch. When Julian knocked on the screen door, he smiled the smile of a politician. Arthur stepped out, wearing his grease-stained overalls, holding a cold cup of black coffee. Julian didn't offer a handshake, he simply opened his briefcase, laid the document on the outdoor table, and gave his opening pitch. He explained, in highly condescending terms, that the city was changing, that progress was unstoppable, and that Vanguard was doing Arthur a massive favor by offering him $50,000 for a property that the city had recently reassessed at a lower value due to the surrounding industrial zoning. What Julian purposefully left out was that Vanguard themselves had lobbied the city council to artificially lower Arthur's property assessment just 3 weeks prior. Julian leaned in close, his voice dropping to a theatrical, sympathetic whisper, and told Arthur that if he didn't sign today, the company would be forced to pursue eminent domain through their political connections, and Arthur would end up with absolutely nothing. He gave Arthur the pen, fully expecting him to take it with a trembling hand. Instead, Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee, looked directly past Julian's shoulder into the hidden camera lens on the oak tree, and smiled. The silence that followed Arthur's smile was deafening. Julian Vance stood on the creaking wooden porch, his hand still extended with the silver pen, expecting the typical compliance he got from elderly homeowners. Instead, Arthur set his coffee cup down with a deliberate click on the metal table. The contrast between the two men was stark: Julian, the polished corporate shark, and Arthur, the weathered mechanic who had spent decades reading people just like he read broken engines. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read the old man's expression. He wasn't used to resistance, especially not from someone whose bank account likely didn't have enough digits to fight a corporate legal team. He cleared his throat, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit, and pushed the paper forward again, pointing to the yellow highlight at the bottom of the page. He repeated his warning, adding a sharper edge to his tone, stating that Vanguard's legal department already had the paperwork drawn up to tie this property up in litigation for the next decade, ensuring that Arthur would spend his twilight years broken-hearted in a courtroom. Arthur didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, laminated piece of paper, placing it directly over the signature line of Julian's contract. It was a copy of the original 1952 deed, signed by the county commissioner, granting the Miller family permanent, non-expiring commercial access to the main thoroughfare. Arthur quietly explained that Vanguard's multi-million-dollar shipping hub required that exact thoroughfare to be legally compliant with county zoning laws. Without it, their trucks couldn't logistically enter or exit the planned facility without violating city noise and weight ordinances. Julian's face flushed a deep crimson. The realization hit him that this wasn't just an uneducated farmer, this was a man who understood the exact structural bottleneck of Vanguard's entire $40 million development project. Julian's polished demeanor completely dissolved, replaced by the ugly, aggressive arrogance that Vanguard usually reserved for closed-door depositions. He stepped closer, invading Arthur's personal space, and dropped all pretense of being a friendly neighborhood developer. Julian leaned over the table, slammed his hand down on the deed, and told Arthur that a piece of paper from the 50s didn't mean anything in a city where Vanguard owned the mayor, the zoning board, and 3 of the 5 city council members. He openly admitted that the recent property devaluation was entirely orchestrated by Vanguard's lobbying arm to squeeze Arthur out. He bragged that by the time Vanguard's legal team was done rewriting the local municipal codes, Arthur's historic deed wouldn't be worth the cheap plastic it was laminated in. Julian sneered, telling the old man that he could either take the $50,000 today and buy himself a nice trailer in the next county over, or Vanguard would ensure the city condemned the building by next month, leaving him homeless. He gave Arthur an ultimatum: sign the paper in the next 60 seconds, or watch everything his family built get demolished by a state-sponsored bulldozer while he sat on the curb with nothing but his grease rags. Inside the farmhouse, the digital dashboard was exploding. The live stream, which had started with a few thousand local residents tracking the zoning dispute, was suddenly going viral. Julian's explicit confession of corporate corruption, bribery of city officials, and intentional property devaluation was broadcasting in pristine, high-definition audio and video to an audience that was doubling every single minute. The chat was a frantic blur of outrage, with viewers clipping the segment and sharing it across major social media networks, tagging the state attorney general, local news outlets, and Vanguard's primary institutional investors. Julian had absolutely no idea that every threat he uttered was being permanently etched into the public record, building an undeniable case of corporate extortion against his employer. He stood there, checking his gold watch, waiting for Arthur to break under the immense pressure of the threat. Arthur simply stood his ground, his arms crossed over his chest, listening to the corporate executioner deliver his speech. He didn't interrupt, he didn't argue, and he didn't get angry. He let Julian talk until the young executive ran out of breath, allowing the full weight of the illegal threats to hang in the air for the microphones to capture perfectly. Arthur knew that in a standard legal battle, Vanguard's money would always win. But this wasn't a standard legal battle anymore, it was a public execution of a company's reputation. When Julian finally stopped talking, looking triumphant and expecting a surrender, Arthur reached over, took the silver pen from Julian's hand, and flipped the contract over to the blank back page. He didn't sign his name. Instead, he wrote a single number in bold, black ink, turned the paper back around, and pushed it across the table toward the stunned executive. The number Arthur wrote wasn't a counteroffer for the property, it was the live viewer count of the stream, which had just crossed 75,000 concurrent viewers. Beside the number, Arthur wrote a short, simple web address. Julian looked down at the paper, his brow furrowing in confusion. He laughed nervously, asking Arthur if this was some kind of joke or a senile delusion. Arthur didn't answer. He just tapped the paper with his thick, scarred finger and told Julian to pull up that exact link on his shiny corporate smartphone. Julian, irritated but intensely curious, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, typing the characters into his browser, completely unaware that his life, his career, and his company's entire $40 million investment were about to evaporate in the span of a single heartbeat. The color completely drained from Julian's face as the web page loaded on his phone. His thumbs trembled slightly as he scrolled through the live chat, watching thousands of comments fly past in real time. All calling for his immediate termination, a state investigation into Vanguard Holdings, and the boycotting of their commercial partners. The video feed at the top of his screen showed a perfectly framed, high-definition shot of his own face, sweating profusely under the midday sun, leaning over Arthur's porch table. The audio was crystal clear, his boastful confession about owning the mayor, manipulating the city council, and artificially tanking the property values was playing back to him in a horrifying loop. He looked up from the screen, his eyes darting frantically around the porch, finally locking onto the tiny camera lens hidden inside the birdhouse mounted to the oak tree. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He hadn't just failed an acquisition, he had single-handedly destroyed the legal and public standing of a multi-million-dollar corporation in front of a global audience. Julian desperately tried to salvage the situation, his arrogant demeanor instantly transforming into a frantic, stuttering panic. He slammed his phone face down on the table and demanded that Arthur shut the cameras off immediately, claiming that recording a private conversation without consent was a federal crime. Arthur didn't even blink. He reached over, picked up a copy of the state's legal code from his chair, and pointed to a highlighted section regarding one-party consent laws. Arthur explained, in a calm, steady voice, that in this state, only one party needed to agree to a recording, and since Arthur was the one hosting the conversation on his own private property, the entire broadcast was completely legal. Julian's legal threats, which had been his primary weapon for years, were rendered entirely useless against an old mechanic who had done his homework. The corporate shark was now completely out of his depth, drowning in a net of his own making. Realizing that intimidation was no longer an option, Julian's tone shifted into a desperate plea. He offered to void the current contract on the spot and promised that Vanguard would pay Arthur double the market value of the property, $100,000, if he would just take the stream down and sign a non-disclosure agreement. He argued that the live broadcast was hurting innocent employees, ruining lives, and that it was just business, nothing personal. Arthur let out a low, gravelly chuckle that cut right through Julian's desperate sales pitch. He reminded Julian of what he had said just 5 minutes earlier about watching the bulldozers tear down his family's history while he sat on the curb with nothing. Arthur told him that when corporate entities use the law as a club to beat down ordinary citizens, it's called just business, but when ordinary citizens use the truth to defend themselves, suddenly it's a tragedy that ruins lives. As Julian stood frozen on the porch, his phone began to vibrate violently in his hand. The screen lit up with the name of Vanguard's Senior Vice President of Public Relations. Julian answered with a shaky voice, and even from a few feet away, Arthur could hear the muffled, screaming voice of Julian's superior on the other end of the line. The corporate headquarters was in absolute chaos. Their stock price was already showing a sharp dip as institutional investors began pulling out of the shipping hub project to avoid being associated with an ongoing bribery and extortion scandal. The vice president ordered Julian to fix the mess immediately, authorized him to pay whatever it took to buy Arthur's silence, and told him that if he couldn't close the deal right now, he shouldn't bother showing up to the office tomorrow. Julian hung up the phone, his hands sweating so badly he almost dropped the device, and looked at Arthur with wide, terrified eyes. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The man who had walked onto the property intending to offer pennies for a lifetime of hard work was now completely at the mercy of the man he tried to exploit. Julian pulled a fresh, blank addendum sheet from his briefcase, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold his pen. He told Arthur that Vanguard would pay him $500,000, cash, right now, with no strings attached, if he would just sign the property over and tell the audience it was all a staged marketing stunt. Arthur looked at the blank paper, then looked back at the camera, knowing that the ultimate decision wasn't just about money anymore, it was about drawing a permanent line in the sand against corporate greed. Arthur didn't take the pen. Instead, he stood up from his chair, walked to the edge of the porch, and pointed toward the end of his gravel driveway where a local police cruiser had just pulled up, followed closely by an investigative news van from the city's major television network. The viral stream had reached the authorities and the local press, and the fallout was arriving in real time. Arthur looked at Julian, who was now visibly hyperventilating, and told him that the time for negotiation had officially ended. The trap had closed, and Vanguard was about to learn exactly what happens when you try to steal from someone who has nothing left to lose but their dignity. But as the flashing lights of the police cruiser cast long, rhythmic shadows across the gravel driveway, a much larger question began to circulate through the digital crowd watching the screen. Was Julian Vance actually the architect of this entire scheme, or was he merely a sacrificial lamb sent by people far more dangerous than a 28-year-old executive? While the immediate threat on Arthur's porch seemed to be deflating, the real mystery was just beginning to unravel in the background. Audiences online noticed a sudden, strange glitch in the live stream data, a massive, coordinated spike in traffic originating from an encrypted server farm in Delaware, the exact state where Vanguard Horizon Holdings kept its corporate registration. Why would a multi-million-dollar tech conglomerate be deploying high-level data interception protocols against a local mechanics amateur streaming setup if this was just a simple zoning dispute? What exactly was buried beneath the foundation of Miller's Automotive that Vanguard was so utterly desperate to bury before the public found out? The local news reporter stepped out of the van, microphone in hand, but before she could even reach the porch steps, Julian's phone rang a second time. This time, he didn't answer it on speaker, but the look of absolute horror that washed over his face suggested the person on the other end wasn't his boss anymore, it was someone else entirely. He dropped his briefcase, leaving the $500,000 contract fluttering in the wind, and practically sprinted toward his luxury vehicle, leaving the media and the police completely in his wake. What did that caller say to him that made a high-ranking corporate executive abandon a legal negotiation and flee a public crime scene? As the stream continued to broadcast, viewers who had been digging into the county's historical zoning maps began posting terrifying discoveries in the chat. It turned out that Arthur's property wasn't just a bottleneck for a shipping route. 30 years ago, before Arthur's father passed away, the land adjacent to the mechanic shop had been owned by a state-run chemical research facility that mysteriously burned down, wiping its records from the public archives. If Vanguard's real objective wasn't building a logistical hub, but rather excavating something highly illegal left behind by that facility, then Arthur's stubborn refusal to move hadn't just stalled a construction project, it had inadvertently threatened to expose a decades-old environmental cover-up involving some of the most powerful political figures in the state. Now, with the police on site and the media rolling, the stakes had instantly escalated from a localized real estate scam to a high-stakes conspiracy. If Vanguard knew the cameras were rolling, and they knew the public was watching, what would their next move be to silence Arthur permanently? Corporate entities of that size don't just accept defeat on a live stream, they change the rules of the game entirely. As the camera frame focused on Arthur standing defiantly on his porch, a dark utility van with tinted windows pulled up across the street, its engine idling silently, watching the house. Who was inside that van, and what were they waiting for the moment the cameras finally went dark? What would you have done if you were standing in Arthur's grease-stained boots at that exact moment? Drop a comment down below right now and let me know. Would you have taken that life-changing $500,000 cash offer and walked away into a comfortable retirement, or would you have stood your ground like Arthur did to protect your family's legacy against a corrupt corporate empire? We see these types of neighborhood standoffs happening all over the country, but rarely do we get to see the exact moment the tables turn in real time. If you believe that predatory developers and corrupt city officials need to be exposed more often, smash that like button right now to help this video break through the algorithm so more people can see the truth about how corporate entities manipulate the system behind closed doors. The story of Miller's Automotive isn't just an isolated incident, it is a blueprint for how ordinary citizens can fight back when they are completely outgunned by money and power. Look at your screen right now. Are you currently subscribed to the channel? If that little button is still red, hit it right now and turn on all notifications. We are tracking this developing investigation closely, including the mysterious utility van that appeared at the edge of Arthur's property and the sudden resignation of the city's zoning director less than 24 hours after the stream went viral. You do not want to miss the upcoming Part 2, where we dive deep into the encrypted corporate documents leaked by a viewer who was watching the broadcast live that day. If this story opened your eyes to how vulnerable our local communities are to corporate overreach, share this video with a friend or family member who loves a good David versus Goliath story. Your engagement is what allows independent investigative storytelling like this to exist, giving a voice to people like Arthur who refuse to be bullied out of their history. Thank you for watching, stay vigilant, and click the video appearing on your screen right now to uncover the dark secret of the state-run chemical facility that Vanguard was so desperate to hide.